Declassified documents explain a Special Forces unit's strange encounter in North Korea. On December 17, 1974, a Special Forces unit was sent on a search and destroy mission in a demilitarized zone in the northernmost part of North Korea. They set out on their mission early that morning. Their objective? To use a winding river as a guide to locate the enemy and neutralize them upon contact. They continued for hours with virtually no encounters. They were miles into the forest and following the winding river when suddenly something changed. The squad leader raises his hand, halting the rest of the crew, as he had noticed that the sounds of the forest had abruptly stopped and it was now completely silent. Up to this point in the mission, it had seemed as though the zone was completely empty. There were no enemies in sight, but the unnatural silence didn't sit right with the lieutenant. As a result, he decides to send 2 groups of scouts ahead to intercept an enemy or look for potential ambush. After letting the scouts get out in front, the rest continued their long trek. Hours later, evening began to approach, and that's when things took a turn for the worst. Night fell as they made their final sweep of the riverbed. Then, they moved to the rendezvous point established with the scout before he left, but he was nowhere to be found. So they quickly radio the rest of the scouts and realized that they had all gone MIA. They assumed that they had been intercepted by the enemy. So in fear that the enemy was close and the same thing would happen to them, the leader decided that they should turn around and head back to base for reinforcements. So they make the quick decision, waste no time, and begin heading south. They were making their way back hastily in fear that the enemy was hot on their trail, when once again, the leader held his hand up to halt. He orders the crew to keep their eyes up, and when they do, they can't believe what they see. As they gazed up into the trees, they noticed a group of dark entities had suddenly surrounded them without their knowledge. At first, thinking they were rebel soldiers, the group leader ordered them to fire on the creatures, so they raised their guns up and let them have it. The entities quickly disappear, and it doesn't seem like anybody made any contact at all. Baffled, the squad leader yells out, "Move, move, move!" as they had to get back to base as soon as possible. The entities continued to follow closely behind, and occasionally the group would stop and fire on one, but they never seemed to be able to hit them. This continued till they were halfway back to their destination, when finally they encountered their stalkers. Forces Unit Strange Encounter North Korea Part 2. They continued to push towards the base, keeping their eyes up into the trees, when finally it seemed like they had outran their pursuers. As they were moving along, they began hearing breaking foliage and leaves crunching at their six. Without order, they all stop in their tracks and look towards the sound. At first, they couldn't see anything, but moments later, dark entities began emerging from the bush. As they approached, the soldiers were frozen in fear. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was a small group of humanoids that stood 8 to 10 feet tall. Their arms long, ending in 3 fingers with claws. Their skin had a slight yellow hue. Their faces were flat with 2 slits where the nostrils were. Their eyes massive and empty, black as night. The soldiers stood stunned as the creatures seemed to pay no attention to them and just simply walked by. After they walked past, the men broke out of their trance and the squad leader yells, "Fire, fire, fire!" and they open fire on the entities. The beings turn around and just stare at the group as the bullets bounce off of them, virtually doing no damage. It was almost as if their skin was a suit of armor, or they were wearing advanced technology. After the soldiers ran out of ammo, the beings slowly turned around and walked off into the darkness, never to be seen again. Once the encounter was over, the group speedily made their way back to base, sprinting for miles. What's odd about this case is there was nothing in the report pertaining to what happened to the scouts that had gone missing. The 10 or so men that survived were the only witnesses that could state anything that took place during that mission. The funny thing is, they all told the exact same story, and after being briefed, it was deemed that they were all of sound state of mind. The only real evidence of this particular occurrence was the testimony of this group. Oddly enough though, the strange encounters in the area wouldn't end here. There were actually 2 more encounters with these beings involving soldiers in the same time period. In my opinion, I believe that they were possibly testing super soldier hybrids in the field of battle. What do you all think? Let me know in the comments. And the other 2 stories, next. A corporal's strange encounter while fighting in Vietnam. This case is similar to a case that took place in 1974 in North Korea. This occurrence happened 50 kilometers from the demilitarized zone in South Vietnam. A corporal and his crew were tracking the hills near a winding river in the treacherous jungle during the war. And after a long day of fighting, they decided to set up camp at the bottom of one of these hills. Night had fallen and everybody was sound asleep when the corporal had started hearing crashing around their tents. So he quickly got out of bed, grabbed his rifle, and went outside. But as he looked around, much to his bewilderment, nobody else woke up, almost as if he was the only one that could hear the sounds. So as his counterpart slept silently, danger loomed, and the corporal began hearing the crashing get closer. As his adrenaline's flowing and his heart is racing, he spots something emerging from the woods. Large, dark entities, about 9 feet tall. As they slowly walked towards him, he was just about to sound the alarm when suddenly it seemed like something was stopping him. So he stood in terror as these entities drew closer and eventually stepped into the moonlight. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The creatures almost glistened as the rays made contact with their skin. They continued approaching to within feet of the corporal. He recalls their silky-like skin, long arms that came down to 3 fingers with claws. The humanoid's face was flat and it had 2 slits where its nostrils were. He stood there frozen, almost as if the entities were controlling him. He recalls a pungent smell emanating from the creatures. The young man, completely helpless, tried to cry out, to no avail. He simply could not speak. At this point, sheer horror had overtaken his body. He eventually came face to face with the beings, and that's when he noticed their lizard-like appearance and their dark, smooth skin. He was so terrified, he'd pass out at the sight of these cryptids, waking up in the morning to a pissed-off lieutenant. He stood there in shock, thinking about the events that occurred the night before, while his corporal scolded him for falling asleep outside the tents. The corporal was silent for months, only telling his story when he got back to headquarters. But it wouldn't do any good, as they would deem him mentally unstable, and they'd put him at the rear of the battalion. But this wouldn't be the last encounter of this type during the war. A year later, 6 men experienced a similar occurrence. Almost a year after the corporal, a 6-man team doing recon near the northern border of North Vietnam encountered a similar experience. Everything was going as it should until around midnight, when a number of entities emerged from the darkness of the woods. These entities again had smooth skin, flat faces, slits for nostrils, and had a nasty aroma about them. As they approached, the men seemed to freeze, unable to say or do anything. The entities ended up within meters of the soldiers, so they got a really good look at what these beings were. They had smooth skin and had 3 fingers at the end of their arms with long claws. And based on what the men experienced, these beings must have some sort of power of telekinesis or mind control. As the beings drew near, the men reported that a nauseating feeling overwhelmed their body. They would eventually pass out in fear and in feeling nauseous. A couple of the men reported being sick for days after the occurrence, almost as if they had some sort of radiation poisoning. Though apparently these documents, in particular the ones about Vietnam, never became declassified, a number of similar reports occurred throughout the entirety of the war. It is assumed that these beings just wanted to see exactly what was happening or how the war was going. They were simply observing what was taking place during the conflict. Many believe these beings were reptoids or some sort of lineage of reptilians. I personally believe that they were some sort of hybrid super soldier that they were testing out in the battlefield. So I hope you enjoyed these videos. I stumbled across them and thought, man, I got to share these. Stay tuned. I'll have more of this content headed your way. Thanks for watching, guys. I am out.